The sun was still maybe 30 minutes from the tree line when Curtis Aiken stopped walking. He stood at the edge of a gravel road at the place where the packed dirt of the town gave way to the county highway, and he looked back at the shed he had spent 3 weeks building. It was a good shed. Solid corners, square roof, the cedar planks fitted tight enough that no winter wind would find a gap. He had done better work in his life, but not often. The railroad company would use that shed for tools and supplies for the next 20 years, if the wood held. The wood would hold. Curtis had made sure of that. His tools were still inside it. He had not been given time to collect them. Behind him, at the edge of the platform, where the new rail line gleamed in the late afternoon light, 2 men in work clothes were watching him. They weren't threatening, exactly. They were just watching, the way you watch a dog you want off your porch. Patient, certain, not yet raising your voice because you don't think you'll need to. One of them had a hand in his pocket. The other had his arms crossed. Curtis had worked alongside both of them for 4 months. He knew their names. He knew one of them had a daughter who'd been sick all winter, and he had asked about her, and the man had seemed genuinely grateful to be asked. That man's arms were crossed now. The sign at the city limit was nailed to a post that had been set in concrete. Someone had wanted it to last. The board was white pine, painted black, and the letters were large enough to read from a moving wagon. Curtis did not read the whole sign. He had read signs like it before, in other places, and reading them in full never made them mean something different than what they meant. What they meant was simple. What they meant was, you are here, and then you are not, and the sun is the clock. He had a wife back at the boarding house on Prentice Street, the one street in town where black workers had been permitted to rent rooms for the duration of the project. He had a wife and 2 satchels, and the wages owed him for the final 3 weeks of work, which the foreman had paid out that morning in cash, as if everyone had known this moment was coming, and the paymaster had simply done the math in advance. 4 months of laying track, driving spikes, tamping gravel, hauling timber, doing the work that the railroad required, and that the town's white residents would not do for the wages being offered. And then, on the day the last spike went in, the town remembered it had a policy. Curtis Aiken turned away from the shed and started back toward Prentice Street. His boots on the gravel made the only sound. There were approximately 10,000 towns like this one in America. Not 10, not 100, not a shocking regional exception that you can mark on a map and point to and say, well, that was the bad part of the country. You know how it was down there. 10,000. Spread from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, in states that had fought for the Union, in states that had sent their sons to die to end slavery, and then come home and built signs and planted them in concrete at their city limits. In Illinois, in Indiana, in Oregon, in Michigan, in Connecticut, in California. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because I think most of us have an image in our heads, a mental map of where racial exclusion happened in America, and that map has a shape, and the shape is roughly the former Confederacy, plus maybe a few uncomfortable exceptions we've heard about. I want to redraw that map for you right now, because the map most of us are carrying is wrong. It is not just wrong around the edges. It is wrong in the center. It is wrong in the places where most of us live, or where our parents lived, or where the suburban house that built your family's wealth was purchased in 1955. 10,000 towns. And I promise you, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a statement of statistical probability, that you have driven through at least one of them without knowing it. You stopped for gas. You ate at a diner. You drove past the city limit sign with its cheerful little population figure and its civic club logos, the rotary wheel and the lion's head, and you did not see the sign that used to be there. The sign came down. The demographics in many cases did not change. This is the story of sundown towns. This is the story of how an entire architecture of racial exclusion was built across the American landscape. Not in the plantation South, but in the suburban and small town North and West and Midwest, and how it shaped the country that exists right now, and why most people who grew up in these towns have never heard the term, and why the silence itself is part of the structure. Let's go back to Curtis. He found Lenora packing. She already had both satchels open on the narrow bed in the boarding house room. The one room they'd been permitted to rent, in a house run by a black family, who had somehow, through what combination of tenure and invisible negotiation Curtis had never fully understood, been allowed to remain in this town year after year. And she was moving with the focused efficiency of a woman who had done this before, and who had long since stopped letting herself feel the full weight of what she was doing while she was doing it. The weight came later. Right now, there was the practical matter of what fit, and what didn't, and what couldn't be left behind. "He say when?" Lenora asked without turning around. "Said sundown." She put a folded dress into the satchel. She smoothed it with her palm. "You get your tools." Curtis was quiet for a moment. "No." Lenora's hand stopped on the dress. Then it continued smoothing, and she did not say anything about the tools, because there was nothing useful to say about the tools. The tools were gone. The cedar shed was not going to give them back. The railroad company was not going to mail them. This was how it worked. You built the thing, and then the thing belonged to the place that had contracted you to build it, and the place had now decided it was done with you, and any materials you had left on its premises were simply part of the settlement. "Clara Jenkins said we can go to her sister in Carlisle," Lenora said. "She has a room." "Carlisle's 40 miles. I know how far Carlisle is." Curtis sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands, the calluses, the split knuckle on his right forefinger that had never quite healed from a winter job 3 years back. He was 37 years old. He had been working since he was 12. He had laid track in 6 states. He had built things, real things, things that would last, things that people would use and rely on long after his name was forgotten in connection with them. And he had been told to leave, with variation, in 4 of those 6 states, and he had left because the alternative was not an alternative, and you learned that early, or you didn't live to learn it at all. "Carlisle it is," he said. They were on the county road before the sun touched the tree line. This was 1903. Curtis and Lenora Aiken were not unusual. They were not the victims of some isolated local madness, some civic aberration that would be corrected when the right people came to their senses. They were participants in a system that was, at that moment, in the process of scaling. The great expulsions, historians would call them that eventually, were just getting started. From roughly 1890 to 1930, hundreds of towns across the American Midwest, the border states, and the West would drive out their existing black populations, often in a matter of days or hours, through a combination of mob violence, property destruction, police non-response, and the simple arithmetic of fear. Curtis had built a railroad. He was made to leave. In the town he left, no black family would reside for the next 60 years. If you think this story is about the South, let me introduce you to Pierce City, Missouri, in the summer of 1901, 2 years before Curtis stood at that gravel road. Pierce City was a town in Lawrence County, a place with a small but established black community, families who had lived there for decades, who owned property, who ran businesses, who had children in school and grandparents in the cemetery. In August of 1901, a white woman was found murdered. A black man was accused. The accusation was enough. A white mob assembled over the course of an evening, and by the next morning, 3 black men were dead. The black neighborhood was burning, and every remaining black resident of Pierce City was fleeing or being driven toward the county line. They never came back. The property they left behind, the houses, the lots, the businesses, was simply absorbed, claimed by neighbors, purchased at nothing prices by people who understood that the sellers would not be returning to negotiate. The church was gone. The school was gone. The graveyard remained, though it would be decades before anyone maintained it. And here is the thing about Pierce City that I need you to understand. The thing that makes it not an exception, but a template. What happened there happened again, and again, and again. Not once a decade, several times a year, in different towns, in different states. Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, when more than 1,000 black residents were expelled after a white woman was murdered, and the entire county's population was rendered a casualty of someone else's crime. Corbin, Kentucky. Boley, Oklahoma. No, wait, not Boley. Boley was a black town. They didn't get expelled. They just got isolated and strangled economically until they couldn't survive, which is a different kind of violence, and we'll get there. Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's hometown, in 1908, when a white mob turned on the city's black community and drove hundreds from their homes. In Abraham Lincoln's hometown, 2 years before the founding of the NAACP, which was founded, in part, in direct response to what happened in Springfield. The narrator has to pause here and acknowledge something, because I keep saying the Midwest and the North, and I want to be precise about why. Because there's a common misconception I'm trying to correct, and I want to be fair while I correct it. The South had terrible racial violence. The South had lynchings. The South had the full apparatus of Jim Crow law. The separate water fountains, the back of the bus, the systematic disenfranchisement, the legal architecture of a caste system. I am not minimizing that. I am not saying the South was somehow not as bad as people think. What I am saying is this: the South had black populations. Because of slavery, because enslaved people were property, and property was concentrated in the South, and the South needed their labor and their bodies, the South had large, established black communities in virtually every county. You cannot build a sundown town in a county where 40% of the population is black. You can terrorize them, impoverish them, disenfranchise them, confine them, and the South did all of those things, but you cannot make them simply not exist. There are too many of them. The Midwest was different. The Midwest had been settled later, largely after the Civil War, and in large portions of it, black people had never been present in significant numbers. There was no plantation legacy, no existing community. The blank slate quality of these towns made them into laboratories for a particular kind of experiment. What if we simply never let them in? And this is where you get sundown towns, not in places that had black communities and destroyed them, though that happened too, but in places that were designed from the beginning to keep black people out. Towns that incorporated, drafted ordinances, passed covenants, and then advertised themselves as all-American communities, a phrase that appeared in Chamber of Commerce literature and local newspapers with a specific, understood meaning. All-American, all-white, by design. Warren Osgood had a desk in the back of the county clerk's office, and on a Tuesday morning in the winter of 1922, he was drafting language. He was 61 years old, a former schoolteacher who had become a councilman who had become a figure of some local consequence, and he was proud of the precise quality of his mind. He did not like sloppiness. He did not like the methods that some of the younger men in the county were advocating, the night riding, the threats, the ugliness. He had seen what that looked like in other towns, and he found it distasteful. Not wrong, exactly. He was not prepared to say that the goal was wrong, but inefficient and bad for the town's reputation, and the kind of thing that attracted newspaper coverage from Chicago and New York that made everyone look like savages. There was a better way. Warren had been working on it for 3 months. The document he was drafting was a restrictive covenant, a clause to be appended to the deed of every property in the township's new residential development, the 43 lots being platted along the ridge above the river, where a man with some foresight and a little capital could build a house that his children's children would still be living in. The covenant would be legally binding. It would run with the land. It would specify in the clear and unambiguous language of property law that no parcel in the development could be sold, rented, leased, or otherwise transferred to any person of African descent or Negro blood, and furthermore that any attempt to do so would render the transfer void and return title to the original grantor. Warren read over the clause again. He made a small amendment to the phrasing. Void and unenforceable at law was crisper than what he'd had before. He dipped his pen. He considered himself a reasonable man. He considered himself, actually, a more humane man than the ones who'd run the Negro families out of Ridgecrest County in 1919 with torches and shotguns. That had been barbaric. Warren had not participated. He had drafted a letter to the county sheriff, which he had ultimately not sent, because there were political considerations, and it would not have changed anything, and some things were simply beyond the scope of local governance. What he was doing now was different. He was solving the problem preventively. He was ensuring that the ugliness of 1919 would not need to repeat itself, because there would be no situation to provoke it. The lots on the ridge would be white lots. The families who bought them would be white families. Their children would attend white schools, worship at white churches, shop at white stores. The town's character, the word character appeared in Warren's mental vocabulary so naturally that he never stopped to examine it, would be maintained, legally, tidily, without the kind of ugliness that made the newspapers. He signed the document at the bottom of the page. He blotted it carefully. He set it in the stack for filing. The result of Warren Osgood's paperwork and the result of the mob in Pierce City were, in the material sense, identical. In both cases, black families were excluded from property in American communities. In both cases, those families could not build wealth there. In both cases, their children could not attend those schools, or benefit from the rising value of that land, or inherit any stake in what was built. The mob had used fire. Warren had used ink. The fire burned for a night. The ink lasted for decades, and in some cases, as we'll discuss, the language of those covenants is technically still in property records today, voided by the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but never physically removed. Still there in the deed, if you know to look. Here is the analysis the narrator wants to offer, right here, at this moment, while Warren's signature is still wet. There is a tendency in the way we discuss American racism to focus on spectacle, on the cross-burning, on the mob, on the dramatic, visual, morally legible brutality that we can look at and say, clearly that was wrong. Those were bad people. I would not have been among them. The paperwork is harder. The paperwork looks like governance. It looks like order. It looks like a respectable man doing a respectable job at a desk in a public building. And the paperwork did more sustained damage than the mob, because the mob went home, and eventually, the mob members died. The paperwork went into the county records office and sat there for 60 years. The system that Warren Osgood was helping to construct would, by its peak in the 1940s and 1950s, encompass an estimated 10,000 communities across the United States. Let's do that math together, because I think the scale of it hasn't quite landed yet. 10,000 communities. The average American town in the mid-20th century had between 2,000 and 5,000 residents. Call it 3,500 on average. 10,000 towns at 3,500 residents each. 35 million people. 35 million white Americans living in communities that were white, not by accident or by free individual choice, but by active, sustained, enforced design. By signs and sirens and police escorts and deed covenants and real estate agents who simply didn't show black buyers houses in certain neighborhoods, and banks that didn't make loans for purchases in certain zip codes, and city councils that didn't issue building permits for certain blocks. This was not the fringe. This was not the Klan holding rallies in a field somewhere. This was the American middle class. This was the suburb. This was the place where post-war prosperity was built, where the GI Bill was cashed, where the American dream was landscaped and fenced and valued by the county assessor every year. The dream was white, not metaphorically, literally. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, the agency that made the post-war housing boom possible, explicitly redlined black neighborhoods, refusing to guarantee mortgages in integrated areas, which meant that banks wouldn't lend there, which meant that the greatest federally subsidized wealth-building event in American history was available, essentially, only to white families. William Levitt understood this perfectly. Levitt built Levittown, New York, in 1947, the first modern suburb, the template for the American dream of a house with a yard and a school around the corner and a highway to the city. Levittown had a policy. The policy was in the lease agreement. The tenant agrees not to permit the premises to be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. When asked about it, Levitt said something revealing. He said, "We can solve a housing problem, or we can try to solve a racial problem, but we cannot combine the two." What he meant was, if we let black families in, white families will leave, and we'll be left with a development no one wants to buy. He was probably right about that. And probably right about that is how a system perpetuates itself without requiring anyone to be a monster. Everyone was just being practical. Everyone was just responding to market conditions. The market conditions had been designed. By the time Theo Banks got into his 1951 Ford and headed north out of St. Louis on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1954, the system was operating at full capacity. Theo was 42 years old, heavyset, with a voice that could fill a room, but which he deployed, on these trips, at a careful quarter volume. He sold encyclopedias. More specifically, he sold the Caldwell Home Reference Library, a 12-volume set with gold-embossed spines, to black schools and black families and the occasional black-owned business across the Midwest and Upper South. He had been doing this for 9 years. He was good at it. He was very good at it, actually. He had a salesman's memory for names and children's birthdays and the particular anxieties and aspirations of parents who wanted more for their kids. And he made enough to keep his family in a good house in St. Louis and send his own 2 children to decent schools. The job required driving. Enormous amounts of driving, through the heart of the country, through the towns and counties, and highway junctions of Illinois and Indiana, and Iowa and Ohio and Missouri. And Theo Banks drove every mile of it with a specific, practiced, fully operationalized system of risk management that would have impressed any actuary. On the passenger seat, next to his sample case, was a book. It was small, pocket-sized, really, with a green cover. The lettering on the front said, "The Negro Motorist Green Book," and below that, the year 1954. It was published annually by a man named Victor Hugo Green, a black postal worker from Harlem who had started it in 1936, and who had, over nearly 2 decades, built it into the most essential travel document in Black America. It listed, by city and town, the hotels and boarding houses and restaurants and beauty parlors and service stations that would serve black customers, that would admit black people through the front door, that would fill your gas tank and take your money and not follow that transaction with a threat or a silence or a look that told you to get out of town before the sun set. Theo knew the 1954 edition almost by memory. He had read it the way a navigator reads a chart, not passively for entertainment, but with his finger on the route, planning, calculating, marking the gaps. A gap in the Green Book was not the absence of a listing. A gap was information. A gap meant, there is no safe stop here. A gap meant, drive through without stopping. A gap meant, if your radiator boils over in this county, you are in a situation that your AAA membership will not help you with. He had planned the day's route the night before, at the kitchen table in his St. Louis house, with the Green Book open and a road atlas beside it. The day would take him north through 3 counties before he reached Millerton, where there was a listed boarding house, Mrs. Ida Greer, proprietress, clean rooms, reasonable rates, colored only, where he would spend the night. Between St. Louis and Millerton, there was a stretch of about 70 miles where the Green Book offered nothing. No hotel, no diner, no gas station. Not because nothing existed in those 70 miles. There were 5 towns along the route, with gas stations and diners and a motor lodge with a sign that said, "Vacancy." There was nothing in those 70 miles, because in those 70 miles, none of those establishments would serve Theo Banks. And at least one of the 5 towns had something else, a reputation. Theo had heard about Crestfield from another salesman, a man named Robert who worked the northern route and who described Crestfield the way you describe weather. Just a fact you accounted for. "Don't stop in Crestfield," Robert had said. "Don't even slow down. If your light comes on, push it to the next county line." Crestfield was not in the Green Book. Crestfield was in the other book, the one that lived in the back of every black traveler's mind, the mental catalog of places where things had happened, where men had been arrested on invented charges, where the police cruiser materialized the moment a black driver pulled into a parking lot and followed him slowly to the edge of town, while the officer in the passenger seat rested his arm on the door in that particular way. Theo drove through Crestfield at 52 miles per hour, eyes forward, hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, speedometer exactly 2 miles per hour below the posted limit. He was through the town in 4 minutes. He did not look at the businesses. He did not make eye contact with the white man who stood on the sidewalk outside the hardware store and watched his Ford pass with an expression that was not quite hostility and not quite anything else. Just a watching. The same watching that the men at the railroad platform had done when Curtis Aiken gathered himself to leave, 50 years earlier, and several hundred miles south. 4 minutes, and Theo was on the open highway again, and he let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, and he drove on. This was the daily life of black travelers in mid-century America, not the dramatic confrontation, not the scene where someone gets hurt and history is made. The daily life was this: the Green Book on the passenger seat, the calculations, the held breath through towns that were not listed, the particular quality of relief that came from finding the boarding house that Mrs. Ida Greer ran, the knock on the door, the cautious moment before it opened, the woman in the doorway who looked at you and saw a man who needed a room, not a problem, not a threat, not a reason to reach for a telephone. Victor Hugo Green had begun the Green Book in 1936 because he understood something precise about American geography. He had understood it as a black man, as a traveler, as someone who had driven far enough north to discover that north of the Mason-Dixon line did not mean what white Americans seemed to think it meant. The idea that racial exclusion was a Southern phenomenon, that once you crossed into free territory, you were in a different country. Green knew this was a fantasy. He knew it from personal experience and from the experience of every black man and woman he knew who traveled. The North had its own system. It was less codified, in some ways, fewer signs, fewer explicit laws, but the results were the same. You couldn't stay here. You couldn't eat there. That town will arrest you if you stop. That county has had incidents. So, Green made a book. He gathered information from his network, from other postal workers, from Pullman porters who knew every city they stopped in, from churches, from the informal infrastructure of black community life that existed alongside and beneath and entirely separate from the white infrastructure of the same country. He put it in a green cover and sold it for a quarter and published it every year, updating the listings, adding new cities, marking places that had changed for better or worse. The Green Book ran from 1936 to 1966. 30 years. It stopped publication the year after the Civil Rights Act took full effect, or rather, Green and his associates believed it would stop being necessary. They were hopeful. They wrote, in the final edition, that they looked forward to the day when such a guide would no longer be needed, when all Americans could travel freely in all parts of their country. Think about that sentence. Think about what it means that it needed to be written at all. A travel guide for surviving your own country. A book that told American citizens which American towns would not arrest them or drive them out or make them fear for their lives. This book, this pocket-sized green-covered book, is one of the most quietly devastating documents in American history, not because of anything terrible that's written in it, but because of what its existence implies about every town and county and city that's not in it. The absence is the data. Theo Banks used the Green Book the way he used the Road Atlas, not as a guarantee, but as a probability map. The listings meant safety was likely. The gaps meant caution was required. He had been in enough gaps to know the difference between a town that was merely inconvenient for black travelers, no listed businesses, but no active hostility either, and a town that had a policy. The policy towns had a feeling. He couldn't always articulate it, couldn't always point to the specific signal that tripped his internal alarm, but after 9 years on the road, he trusted the feeling the way he trusted his car's temperature gauge. When the needle moved, you paid attention. In the early 1950s, the feeling was everywhere. Not in every town, but in enough of them. In the Midwest especially, you could drive for an hour and feel the country's demographics tell you something. The whiteness of it. The specific, total, unbroken whiteness that was too consistent to be accidental, that had the quality of a managed thing, a kept thing. The kind of whiteness you only get when someone has been maintaining it. Pearl Kimball had not intended to maintain anything. She had not sat down and made a policy decision. It had happened the way most things in her life happened. Gradually, practically, in response to circumstances that presented themselves and to which she responded in what seemed, in the moment, like the obvious way. Pearl was 53 years old, and she ran the general store her late husband Harold had built in 1921, and she had been running it alone since Harold's heart gave out in 1946, and she ran it competently and carefully, and with the kind of rigid economy that comes from understanding exactly how little margin you are working with. The store was not profitable in any dramatic sense. It was survivable. Each month the income slightly exceeded the expenses, and Pearl kept the lights on and the shelves stocked, and sent her daughter Ruth Ann through 2 years of secretarial school, and the possibility of anything going wrong, any disruption to the careful arithmetic of the store's operation, filled her with a dread that was physical, something she felt in her chest. In the spring of 1948, a family had stopped at her store. They had come in off the highway, a man and a woman and a small child, traveling, their car loaded with luggage. The woman had asked for crackers and a tin of sardines and a bottle of soda pop. Pearl had sold them what they asked for. She had taken their money and made change. The man who came in next was one of her regulars. He had looked at the black family, at the mother counting change on the counter, at the child standing close to the father's leg looking up at the shelves. And then he had looked at Pearl, and the look had said everything without saying anything. That evening, Pearl had overheard 2 women talking outside. By the end of the week, she had lost 7 regular customers. 7. She counted them. She watched them drive past the store without stopping, and she understood precisely what was happening and precisely why. And she honestly did not consider herself a bigot. She had nothing against those people. She had simply calculated what she could afford to lose. 7 customers. She could not afford 7 customers. She could not afford 3 customers. Ruth Ann still had a year of school left, and the store needed a new furnace. And Harold's brother had been right about the note on the building. They were too close to the line. There was no room for a statement of principle. The next time, Pearl was at the counter when the bell above the door rang, and she saw who it was. And she said, quietly, not unkindly, She would insist on this to herself for the rest of her life. She was not unkind about it. She said she couldn't help them. That was all. Just that she couldn't help them. The couple had looked at her for a moment, and then they had left, and Pearl had straightened the jar of penny candy on the counter, and the regular customer who had been browsing in the back of the store had nodded at her approvingly when he came up to pay for his tobacco, and Pearl had made exact change and put the money in the drawer. She told herself, "I am not that kind of person. I am just a woman trying to keep a store open. This is not about what I believe. This is about what I can afford. Here is what I want you to hold alongside Pearl's calculation. Multiply it. Multiply it by every store owner in every Sundown town, in every county in the Midwest and West and border states. Multiply it by every gas station that declined to fill a black traveler's tank, every diner that didn't have a section for colored customers, every real estate agent who showed the lovely house on Elm Street to the white couple and never mentioned it to the black couple who had called that morning. Multiply it by every bank loan officer who found technical reasons why this particular application didn't meet the standards, every school board that drew the district lines in the way that kept certain neighborhoods in certain schools. None of these people thought of themselves as architects of a system. They thought of themselves as Pearl thought of herself. Practical people responding to circumstances. They weren't wrong that the circumstances were real. They were wrong that the circumstances were natural, that the whiteness of their towns, the economic pressure against serving black customers, the social cost of doing business across racial lines had simply arisen from the landscape. Like weather, it had been constructed. Deliberately, over decades, by men like Warren Osgood with their legal pads and by mobs in Pierce City with their torches, and by every mayor who posted a sign at the city limit, and every police officer who escorted a black driver to the county line, and by the FHA officials in Washington who drew the red lines on the maps. Pearl Kimball did not build the system. She maintained it. She maintained it with the quiet, economic, utterly mundane force of a woman who could not afford to lose 7 customers, and that maintenance, distributed across millions of Pearl Kimballs in 10,000 towns, was what made the system work. No individual law required her cooperation. The social and economic environment did, and the social and economic environment had been carefully, deliberately engineered. In 1940, the population of the United States was approximately 132 million people. Black Americans constituted about 10% of that, roughly 13 million people. Most of them lived in the South, where the history of slavery had concentrated them, and where Jim Crow law constrained them, but at least did not deny their existence. The Great Migration, the movement of black Americans from the South to the North and West, was ongoing, and by the time it concluded in the 1970s, 6 million people would have relocated. Where did they go? They went to cities: Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Paul, Los Angeles, New York. They went to cities because the cities were where the industrial jobs were, the factories, the stockyards, the steel mills. They went to cities also because the cities were the places where sundown towns were not. Because you cannot run a city of 1 million people as a sundown town. The logistics don't work. And because the cities had their own black neighborhoods, their own institutions, churches, newspapers, mutual aid societies, the infrastructure of community. What the cities did not have, what the cities were specifically, actively, structurally prevented from having, was the suburb. Levittown was built for veterans. The GI Bill gave veterans low-interest mortgages, and the FHA backed those mortgages, and the highway system that the federal government was building made the suburbs accessible to the factories and offices in the city. The whole apparatus was a spectacular piece of policy engineering, and it worked. It created the American middle class that you see in photographs from the 1950s. The house, the lawn, the station wagon, the barbecue on the back patio. It was the largest single wealth creation event in American history. Black veterans had served in the war. They had come home. They had applied for GI Bill mortgages. They had been denied, in enormous proportions, by a system that would not guarantee loans in black neighborhoods and would not approve black buyers in white neighborhoods, and had therefore built an effective brick wall between black Americans and the suburbs where the money was going. This is the sentence that I think changes the way you read the rest of this story. They didn't just exclude people from towns, they excluded people from wealth. The property values in Levittown and its 10,000 imitators across the country rose over the following decades by factors of 10, 20, 50. A house bought in 1950 for $8,000, with a GI Bill mortgage and an FHA guarantee available only to white buyers, was worth $120,000 in 1980. The family that bought that house had $112,000 in equity. They sent their children to schools funded by property taxes on those values. They took out second mortgages to pay for college, for businesses, for the next generation's down payments. That $8,000 became a legacy. The black family that had applied for the same loan in the same year and been denied, and had rented in the city, and watched their neighborhood be redlined and disinvested and eventually bulldozed for a highway, that family's trajectory was different. Not because of individual failure, because of geography, because of a map that had been drawn by Warren Osgood's legal pad and Victor Green's Green Book and the FHA's red lines, and Pearl Kimball's calculation about 7 customers, and by the concrete post in the ground with the white pine sign nailed to it. The sign that Curtis Aiken had not read in full, because he'd read signs like it before. The sun was going down. He walked back to Prentice Street. He and Lenora left before dark. And that decision, to leave, to comply, to not be in the town when the sun set, cost them everything they could not carry in 2 satchels. It cost them the shed with the tools. It cost them the wages they would never earn in that town. It cost them the property they might have bought, the business Lenora might have built, the accumulating value of 40 years of belonging somewhere. Let's talk about Oregon. I keep saying the Midwest, and I want to make sure we don't leave the West Coast feeling comfortable. Oregon had a constitution. Oregon was a free state. It entered the Union in 1859 on the free side, the Union side, the ostensibly correct side of American history. Oregon's Constitution, ratified in 1857, included an exclusion clause. The clause banned black people from living in the state. Living there. Not from voting, not from certain occupations, from residing in Oregon at all. It was updated slightly in subsequent years, but the essential prohibition remained in the state's founding document until 1926, when voters repealed it, 69 years after its adoption. 69 years. Ratified 1857, repealed 1926. Which means that for the first 69 years of Oregon's existence as an American state, the legal exclusion of black residents was written into the founding document, alongside the protection of free speech and the separation of powers and all the rest of the constitutional furniture that Oregonians were proud of. Oregon is, in the contemporary cultural geography of the United States, understood as a progressive state. Portland is understood as a liberal city, and it is in many respects. It is also a city with one of the lowest proportions of black residents of any major American city, and a state that is approximately 85% white, and a history that explains both of those facts if you're willing to look at it. California had its own version. Glendale, the suburb northeast of Los Angeles, the perfectly pleasant suburban city where you might buy a house and raise children and never think twice about, was a sundown town for most of the 20th century. Not a quiet inference sundown town, either. Glendale in the early part of the century was explicit about it. The local newspaper ran editorials defending the town's racial character. Real estate agents operated under a gentleman's agreement that was not particularly gentle, and was not an agreement so much as a professional expectation enforced by social and economic pressure. Black families who inquired about Glendale properties were redirected. Black travelers who stayed too long were encouraged to leave. In Connecticut, the Northeast, the land of Yankee liberalism, Darien enforced its whiteness through the real estate covenant system with the precision of a Swiss watch. Darien was wealthy. It is still wealthy. It used its wealth and its civic institutions and its network of property law to ensure that its pleasantness was available only to the right people. No signs were needed. No sirens. The machinery was invisible and efficient and completely effective. In Michigan, Grosse Pointe, the wealthy enclave outside Detroit, developed what became known as the point system. The point system was a formal evaluation procedure by which prospective homebuyers were scored on a scale before a real estate agent would show them a property. The scoring criteria included occupation, English spoken at home, way of life, and, explicitly, race. The system was documented and defended. It was, in its designers' minds, a rational approach to maintaining community character. The result was a community that remained white, while Detroit, immediately adjacent, became the most racially segregated major city in America. There is something almost admirable, in a purely technical sense, about the creativity of the exclusion. The mob was crude, the sign was crude, but the point system, the covenant, the gentleman's agreement, these had the quality of engineering. These were solutions to a perceived problem, and the solutions were elegant and durable, and, until the law caught up with them, entirely effective. Theo Banks drove past Grosse Pointe on a gray November afternoon in 1957 and did not stop because his Green Book had no listings there. And the listings in Grosse Pointe were not in the Green Book because the Green Book only listed places that would serve him, and in Grosse Pointe there were no such places. He drove on to Detroit, where there was a boarding house on Gratiot Avenue, listed in 1957 under Detroit, Michigan, hotels and guest houses, where the proprietor would rent him a room, and he would eat dinner from a paper bag and go over his sales records for the day, and prepare his pitch for tomorrow. The ritual of the Green Book was, at its core, a ritual of survival. Not survival in the dramatic, immediate physical danger sense, though that was real, and Theo had heard enough stories to know it was real, but survival in the longer, more grinding sense. The survival of dignity, the survival of the working day, the ability to get through the week without an incident that derailed your route, cost you customers, cost you income, cost you the careful equilibrium that kept your family in a good house in St. Louis. Theo did not use the Green Book because he was afraid of every town. He used it because the cost of getting it wrong was too high, and the book was the best information available, and he was a practical man who made his living by being organized. He had a joke, a private joke, not one he told to white people, not one he told to his clients, but one he told to Robert and to his brother, and to the other black men he knew who navigated the country for their livelihoods. The joke was this: he knew more about the racial policies of small Midwestern towns than most of the people who lived in them. He had data. He had a sample size. He had, across 9 years of routes, encountered the policies of hundreds of towns, and he had filed the information in his head with the precision of a geographer. This town is safe. That town is borderline. It depends on the officer on duty. That county you skirt. That stretch of highway you do not stop on after dark. The knowledge was exhaustive. The knowledge was work. The knowledge was 9 years of his mental life dedicated to a map that no one else had to carry. White salesmen drove the same highways and thought about their pitches and their quotas and the baseball game on the radio. Theo thought about all of those things, and also about the map. The map was always there, running underneath everything else, the background process that kept the day from going wrong. He turned south toward Indianapolis. The sky was getting dark. He checked his fuel gauge, 3/4, good. He would not need to stop until he was well past the gap in the Green Book listings outside Crawfordsville. He turned the radio up slightly. A Nat King Cole song was playing, and Theo let himself, for about 4 bars, stop thinking about the map. The Civil Rights Act was signed in July of 1964. The Fair Housing Act was signed in April of 1968. Both were laws. Both were real. Both changed things. Changed the formal, legal architecture of discrimination in ways that were genuinely significant, that opened doors that had been closed, that gave Black Americans legal recourse against the most explicit and documentable forms of exclusion. They did not change sundown towns. I do not mean this as cynicism. I mean it as a description of how systems work. A town that has been all white for 80 years does not integrate because a judge says so. The law changes the rules of the game. It does not, by itself, change the board. The board, the geography, the property values, the school districts, the social networks, the habits and inheritances of a community. The board was shaped by decades of exclusion, and law cannot reshape it in a single stroke. Vidor, Texas had a public housing project. By the early 1990s, in the United States of America, 25 years after the Fair Housing Act, the public housing project in Vidor, Texas, was all white. Not because of an explicit policy. The policy had been illegal since 1968. But because the town's reputation was what it was, and Black residents did not apply for housing in Vidor, and the housing authority did not actively recruit them, and nothing much changed year after year until a federal judge looked at the situation and said, "This needs to stop." The judge ordered integration. In 1993, the first Black resident moved into the Vidor housing project under court order. The response from the town's white residents was not a point system. It was not a covenant. It was more direct than that. The Black family received threats. Their home was vandalized. They were followed. They were made, through sustained, targeted harassment, to feel that they were not safe in Vidor, that the town's informal policy, which had predated the law and survived the law, was still operative, still enforced, still backed by a communal willingness to make life intolerable for anyone who violated it. Within months, the Black residents who had moved in under the court order had moved out. This was 1993, not 1893, not 1933, 1993. The year of the World Trade Center bombing, the year Schindler's List came out, the year most of the people reading this were alive and paying at least some attention to the news. The town's Sundown character, its essential constitutive whiteness, had survived the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, the Fair Housing Act, and a direct federal court order. It had survived because legal change and actual integration are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where a lot of American history lives. Forsyth County, Georgia, had its own reckoning in 1987. Forsyth County had expelled its Black population in 1912. All of them, more than 1,000 people, after a white woman was murdered, and the county's collective fear and fury required a target, and found one. The Black residents fled, or were driven, in a matter of days. Their property was taken. Their community was dismantled. For 75 years, Forsyth County remained essentially all white, a state of affairs that required no ongoing active maintenance, because the original expulsion had been so complete that there was no one left to exclude. In January 1987, civil rights marchers entered Forsyth County. They were walking to protest the county's racial history. They were met by counter-protesters. The counter-protesters carried Confederate flags. They threw rocks. They screamed. The National Guard had to be deployed to protect marchers exercising their constitutional right to walk down a public road in an American county. This was 1987, the year of Iran-Contra, the year Die Hard came out in theaters. In 1987, Civil rights marchers needed National Guard protection to walk down a public road in a county whose racial character had been established by expulsion and maintained by 75 years of enforced absence. The thing about sundown towns that I want you to really feel, as we move toward the present, is the persistence. Not the drama of the original expulsion or the confrontation or the sign. The persistence. The way that a thing established in 1912 or 1903 or 1922 can simply remain in place, carried forward not by active maintenance, not by mobs or signs or police escorts, but by inertia, by the shape of a community that was formed by exclusion and that continues to reflect that shape because nothing has happened to change it. The expulsion happened once. The resulting demography has required no further action. The exclusion is baked in. This is how geography becomes history, becomes present. Mavis Hawley was 71 years old in 2003, and she lived in a brick house on the east side of Decatur, Illinois, that her parents had bought in 1951. One of the first black families allowed on that block. A purchase that had required 3 failed applications to other neighborhoods before a seller had finally agreed to take their money. Mavis remembered the neighborhood in 1955, 1958, the way it was when she was young. She remembered her father checking the Green Book before he drove anywhere. She remembered the town he didn't drive through. The one to the northwest, the one with the siren. She had never heard the siren herself, but she had heard about it from enough people, described with enough consistent detail, that she could hear it in her imagination. A municipal whistle, the kind used for fire alerts, blown at 6 in the evening, and everyone in the county who needed to understood what it meant. She remembered the conversations her parents had at the dinner table about where you could go. This was not theoretical. This was practical, the way conversations about the weather or the grocery budget are practical. You needed to know which roads were safe. You needed to know which towns were on the acceptable side of the line. You needed to have this information the way you needed to know how to drive, because not knowing it had consequences that knowing it didn't. Her father had been a careful man. He had worked for the railroad, not laying track by that point, but in a clerical capacity, in an office, one of the positions that had opened up in the late 1940s as the calculus of what was acceptable shifted slowly. He had worn good suits. He had spoken with precision. He had navigated a working life that required him to be, at all times, impeccable in the way that people who are not given the benefit of the doubt must be impeccable, not because he was naturally formal, but because the cost of an informal impression was not available to him. He had died in 1978, and Mavis had kept the house, and she still lived there in 2003, and she was standing in the kitchen one Thursday morning, watching her granddaughter Diane back the car out of the driveway to drive to her university 40 miles north. 40 miles north took you through Whitfield County. Mavis had not said anything to Diane about Whitfield County. Diane was 20 years old and drove a car with a working GPS and a cell phone in her cup holder, and a confidence in her own navigation of the world that Mavis recognized as generational. Not arrogance, exactly, but the absence of a certain knowledge that Mavis had been given early and carried always. The knowledge of the map, the background process. Whitfield County in 2003 was not posting signs. Nobody was blowing a siren at 6 o'clock. The police were not, as a matter of official policy, escorting black drivers to the county line. But Whitfield County in 2003 was 97% white. It had been 97% white in 1950. It had been essentially 100% white in 1930, after the expulsion of its small black community in 1927, an event that was not well documented because the people who might have documented it were the ones being expelled. The shape of the county, its demographics, its real estate values, its social networks, its schools, reflected a century of enforced whiteness that had created conditions that would maintain themselves without any further active effort. Diane drove through Whitfield County on her way to the university. She drove through without incident. Nobody stopped her. She didn't notice anything unusual about the place, except perhaps that it was very white, which a lot of places were, and which she had learned to file as background information rather than foreground. She got to her class, and she called her grandmother that night, and she said everything had been fine. The drive was fine. The class was good. Mavis said that was wonderful. She was glad. She did not mention Whitfield County. Here is a question that I've been circling around, and I think it's time to ask it directly. Why don't most Americans know about sundown towns? This is not a rhetorical question. I mean it as a genuine inquiry. Sundown towns were not secret. The signs were public. The ordinances were public records. The Green Book's existence was published information. The expulsions happened in front of witnesses and were occasionally covered by newspapers. This was not a buried conspiracy. It was a public system. And yet, when historian James Loewen published Sundown Towns in 2005, it was the first comprehensive study of the phenomenon. 1963 was the first comprehensive study of the term itself. 2005, 102 years after Curtis Aiken walked away from the shed he'd built, was the year someone finally wrote the book. Part of the answer is, the people who experienced sundown towns knew about them, and their knowledge was transmitted in the ways that community knowledge is transmitted, through family, through the informal networks of Black American life, through the Green Book and its successors and its precursors. But they were not writing the history textbooks. They were not deciding what went into the 9th grade social studies curriculum. The people who decided those things were, in many cases, the people who had grown up in sundown towns, or near them, or in the cultural and political environment that had produced them, and who had strong incentives to understand those towns as normal, as the natural state of things, as simply how the country was, rather than as the outcome of a century of deliberate engineering. History is written by the winners, the saying goes, but that's too dramatic. History is written by the people who have the most access to the institutions that write it, and for most of the 20th century, those people were white. Not conspiratorially, not with a secret plan to suppress the truth, but with the ordinary, undramatic, entirely predictable result of a perspective shaped by never having needed the Green Book, by having always been on the right side of the sign, by having grown up in a town whose whiteness felt natural because they had never been told otherwise. The silence was self-reinforcing. The fewer people who knew, the fewer who asked. The fewer who asked, the fewer who wrote about it. The fewer who wrote, the fewer who taught. The fewer who taught, the fewer students who grew up to know that the town they grew up in, the nice town, the safe town, the town their parents' equity came from, had been built on an architectural principle of exclusion that had shaped their family's wealth and their community's composition, and the school they attended, and the world they thought of as simply the world. Warren Osgood's Inc., still in the records office, still in the deed, technically, even now. Let me give you the scale of the legacy in numbers, because I think the abstract language sometimes lets people off the hook. The racial wealth gap in the United States in the early 21st century is, by various measures, approximately 10-1. The median white family has roughly 10 times the wealth of the median black family. This gap is not a mystery. It is not the unexplained residue of cultural difference or individual choice. It has a map. The map looks like the Sundown Town map, because the primary vehicle for middle-class wealth accumulation in 20th century America was real estate, and the real estate system was racially segregated, by law and by practice, for most of that century. A black family excluded from Levittown in 1950 could not buy a house in Levittown, could not accumulate the equity, could not pass it on. The family's descendant in 2000 does not have that equity, not because anything happened to it. It was never created. The exclusion was not merely a matter of dignity, though it was a profound matter of dignity. It was a matter of compound interest. It was a matter of what happens to $8,000 invested in a house in 1950 when you multiply it by 50 years of suburban property value appreciation. You get the racial wealth gap. You get it not as a mystery, but as arithmetic. The school districts followed the same logic. Property tax funding of public schools, the system used by most American states, means that wealthy communities with high property values have well-funded schools, and poor communities have underfunded ones. The wealth of the communities is not random. It reflects the accumulated effect of decades of real estate policy that built wealth in some neighborhoods and withheld it from others. The school in the Sundown suburb has the new computers and the full-time art teacher and the advanced placement courses. The school in the neighborhood where black families were channeled has the 40-year-old textbooks and the teacher vacancy that can't be filled. The children of both communities did not choose this. They were born into it. They were born into the shape that Warren Osgood's pen made 80 years before. In 2003, the year Mavis watched her granddaughter drive north, there were still communities in the United States where a black family had never lived, not because of a law, the law said they could, but because of a century of enforced absence that had shaped the community's culture and real estate market and social networks into a form that perpetuated itself without needing a sign. Some of these communities knew their history. Most did not, or knew it in the partial, carefully edited way that communities know uncomfortable history, which is to say they knew the general shape of it without knowing the specific weight. They knew the town had always been a certain way. They did not know why. They had not been taught why. The why was in the county records office, in the deed covenants, in the ordinance books, in the archives of the local newspaper that had published editorials in 1924 defending the town's American character. The why was there, if you went looking. Most people did not go looking because not knowing was comfortable, and knowing would complicate the story they told themselves about the place they were from. Here is something I've been holding back, because I wanted you to understand the scale before I said it, but I think you understand the scale now. There is a specific flavor of American innocence, a pride in regionalism, in small-town life, in the quality of a place that has known its own people for generations, that has a main street and a 4th of July parade and a high school football team, that I want to talk about for a moment. Because this pride is not false. The things being celebrated are real. The community, the continuity, the sense of belonging that comes from knowing where you are from and having that place know you back. But the community, the continuity, in 10,000 American towns, these things were built on a cleared field. A field that was cleared, sometimes in a day, by mob violence, and more often over decades by ordinances and covenants and economic pressure, and police escorts and signs. The belonging that white residents of sundown towns felt, the warmth of the known community, the safety of the familiar, was not a free gift of nature. It was, in part, a product of systematic exclusion. The town felt safe and familiar and homogeneous because it had been made safe and familiar and homogeneous deliberately at someone else's expense. I am not saying that every white person in a sundown town was a conscious participant in that exclusion. Most of them were not. Most of them, like Mavis's neighbors who moved in after 1951 and didn't ask why the neighborhood had been white before they arrived, were simply living in a place that had been arranged for them in advance. They didn't build the arrangement. They just occupied it. But here is the thing. You don't have to build the arrangement to benefit from it. The equity in the house accumulates whether or not you know about the covenant in the deed. The school district's wealth is there whether or not you know about the redlining that shaped it. The community's social networks include you and exclude others whether or not you designed them that way. Benefiting from a system does not require understanding the system. It just requires being on the right side of it. And being on the right side of it, in 10,000 American towns, meant being white. Let me come back to Mavis one more time, because her story isn't finished yet, and because I think she's carrying something that the rest of this narrative has been building toward. In the fall of 2003, Mavis's church organized a bus trip to a sundown town, one that had been documented in James Lowen's research, one that was approximately 40 miles from Decatur, a town with a population that was, in the 2000 census, 99.2% white. The trip was not confrontational. It was not a protest march. It was more like a pilgrimage, organized by the church's History Committee, which had been working for 2 years on a project about the Great Migration and its antecedents, the push factors, the things that had driven black families north, as well as the pull factors, the things that had drawn them to specific cities. The bus pulled into the town's main street on a Saturday afternoon in October, and the members of Mavis's church walked around for a couple of hours. They went into a few stores. They ate lunch at a diner. Nobody threatened them. Nobody called the police. The town in 2003 was not the town of 1940 or 1920, and the distinction mattered. Things had changed. The sign was gone. The siren had been silent for decades. A black family could, technically, move to this town. Nobody would stop them. Nobody had moved there. 99.2%. The economics made it self-perpetuating now. The town had high property values and low housing inventory. The school district was well-funded. The demographics had attracted the kind of investment that attracts more investment. It had become, through the momentum of its own enforced history, the kind of place that appealed to people who valued exactly what it offered: the continuity, the community, the schools, and the people who had been excluded from it for a century had been building wealth elsewhere, in other circumstances, under other conditions, and could not necessarily afford the entry price even when the door was no longer legally barred. The sign came down. The architecture remained, not as metaphor, as actual architecture: the school buildings, the housing stock, the road infrastructure, the assessed values, the district lines. These were physical facts, built over a century, reflecting a century of investment that had been available to some and not to others. You cannot remove them with a legal ruling. You cannot undo compound interest by making it illegal to have charged it. You can open the door, and that matters. That is not nothing. Opening the door genuinely matters. But opening the door does not rebuild the house that was never allowed to be built. Mavis sat in the bus on the way back to Decatur and watched the flat Illinois landscape go by, the fields and the water towers and the county roads, and she thought about her father's careful suits and his green book on the kitchen shelf, and the conversations at the dinner table about which roads were safe. She thought about the tools in the shed, Curtis Aiken's tools, though she did not know Curtis's name, but she knew men like him, had heard stories of men like him, the tools that got left behind when you had to pack in a hurry and get out before dark. She thought about her granddaughter Diane, driving north on Thursdays, going through Whitfield County with her cell phone in the cup holder and her GPS, and her total absence of the map that Mavis had been given. Mavis thought, "This is good. The absence of the map is good." She should not need the map. The whole point of all of it, of all the work and the struggle and the legal fights and the slow, terrible grinding forward motion of 70 years of civil rights history, was that Diane should not need the map. But Mavis also thought, the map is still real. The geography is still there. Whitfield County is still 97% white, and the school in Whitfield County is still better funded than the school in Diane's neighborhood in Decatur. And the reason for that, the source of that gap, the moment it was created, is in a courthouse somewhere, in a deed record, in an ordinance book, in the concrete base of a signpost from which the sign was long ago removed. The absence of the sign is not the same as the absence of the sign's effects. This is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that I want to leave you with, because it's the thing that distinguishes the history of sundown towns from a simple story about the past. Sundown towns are not just history. They are present geography. They are the shape of the country as it actually exists, the distribution of wealth, the demography of schools, the composition of communities. And that shape was not formed by nature or by free individual choice, but by a century of deliberate, systematic, engineered exclusion that has been largely forgotten by the people who benefited from it, and carried, often as burden and rarely as pride, by the people who were excluded from it. James Loewen published his book in 2005, and it was reviewed and discussed and recognized as important. And then it moved, gradually, into the particular position that inconvenient histories occupy in American culture, which is known but not taught, documented but not integrated, available to anyone who looks and invisible to anyone who doesn't. The book is in libraries. The history is in the county records. The covenants are technically still in the deeds, voided but present, like a scar that has healed over without being treated. 10,000 towns. You have driven through at least one. The sign at the edge of town, the one that used to say what it said. It was wood and paint. White pine, painted black, the letters large enough to read from a moving wagon. Some of them were official city property, maintained by the Public Works Department, replaced when they faded. Some were hand-painted by individual enthusiasm. Some were simply understood. No sign necessary, the understanding complete without one. The sign came down. In most towns it came down quietly, without ceremony. Nobody documented the moment. The post stayed in the ground for a while, and then someone removed it, or it rotted, and there was just the concrete base, and eventually someone paved over that too, or it was covered with grass. You would not know it had been there unless you looked very carefully at the soil, or unless someone told you, and in most places no one told you, because the telling was uncomfortable, and the silence was easy. Curtis Aiken walked away from the shed. He never recovered his tools. He and Lenora went to Carlisle, and then to another town, and eventually to Chicago, where the Great Migration was depositing hundreds of thousands of people from the South, and the expelled communities of the Midwest, all of them carrying 2 satchels or the equivalent, all of them finding their way to the parts of the city that were available to them. The Black Belt on the South Side, the neighborhoods that the real estate covenants and the redlining had designated as the acceptable zone. They built lives there. They built community. They sent children to school. They could not buy houses in most of Chicago's neighborhoods either, because the covenants covered the whole city, not just the individual sundown towns, and the FHA's red lines covered Chicago's map like a rash. Curtis worked until he was 62. He never owned a house. He rented in the South Side for 30 years, and the money he paid in rent went to a landlord who owned 6 buildings in the neighborhood and who did not maintain them because the tenants had nowhere else to go, and the buildings declined, and the neighborhood declined. And by the time Curtis died, in 1944, the neighborhood had the quality that neighborhoods have when a century of investment has been withheld from them. The particular shabbiness that is not the result of the residents' choices, but of a geography of disinvestment that preceded them and surrounded them, and persisted, regardless of how hard they worked or how careful they were with their money. He never saw inside the shed again. Theo Banks retired from the road in 1968, the year the Fair Housing Act passed, the year Victor Green's book published its final edition. He had been driving those routes for 23 years. He had covered, he once calculated, somewhere in the range of 400,000 miles of American road, which is not quite twice around the Earth at the equator, which is more miles than most Americans drove in a lifetime, and he had driven most of those miles with the Green Book on the passenger seat and the map in his head, and he was tired. He was tired in a way that was not just physical. He was tired in the way that sustained vigilance makes you tired. The kind of tired that comes from 23 years of background process, of the perpetual running calculation, of being in your own country and never entirely certain that the next stop was safe. He saw the Fair Housing Act signed on television. He sat in his living room in St. Louis and watched the president's pen move across the paper, and he thought, this should have happened 40 years ago. He thought, we'll see what it changes. He thought, I am going to sleep for a long time. He was right to be cautious about the law. He had seen enough of the gap between legal change and actual change to know that the gap was wide and took a long time to close, and that in some places it did not close so much as stop widening. He was right, but he was also, and this matters, right that the law was real, that it mattered that the sign could no longer be there, that the formal apparatus of legal exclusion being dismantled was a genuine change, even if the informal apparatus remained, and the geography remained, and the wealth gap remained. Legal change is not everything. It is not nothing. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the failure to hold them both, the tendency to collapse into either the law changed everything or the law changed nothing, is part of why this history is so hard to talk about honestly. Warren Osgood died in 1951. He died in the town he had helped keep white, in a house whose deed bore the covenant he had drafted, and he was buried in the town cemetery with a modest stone, and the obituary in the local paper described him as a devoted civic servant, a man of integrity, a good neighbor. The covenant outlived him by 17 years until the Fair Housing Act. The demographic effect of the covenant outlived the law and is living still. Pearl Kimball closed the store in 1963 when her daughter Ruth Ann's husband got a job in Columbus and she moved to be near her grandchildren. She was in her 70s by then, a small, precise woman who went to church on Sundays and was well regarded in the community for her reliability. She had thought about that black family sometimes, over the years, the woman counting change on her counter, the child looking up at the shelves. She hadn't done anything to them. She had just said she couldn't help them. She had been practical. She had been, by the standards of her community, a reasonable person. This is the hardest part, not the mob and not the sign, but the reasonable person. The mob went away. The sign came down. The reasonable person stayed, and made her calculation, and multiplied across 10,000 towns, and that multiplication was the system's maintenance mechanism. Not the exceptional cruelty, but the ordinary practicality. The economics of complicity are not dramatic. They are a woman straightening a jar of penny candy after she has sent a family away. They are the absence in the Green Book. They are the shape of the town that emerges from 10,000 such calculations, each one defensible in isolation, each one a brick in the architecture. I want to name that architecture now. The word for it that I've been working toward throughout this entire story. The word is normal. The architecture's primary material was normalcy. The Sundown town worked not primarily because of the exceptional violence of the mob or the dramatic injustice of the sign, but because it was normal. Because the white residents of 10,000 American towns understood their community's whiteness as a natural condition, as the default, as simply how things were, rather than as the outcome of a century of deliberate effort. The normalcy was the point. It hid the work. A town that has been managed into whiteness for 3 generations no longer looks managed. It just looks like a town. It looks like a community. It looks like the kind of place where people raise their children and know their neighbors and feel safe and comfortable and at home. And they are home. The white residents are genuinely home. I am not dismissing the reality of community or the value of belonging. I am saying that the home was built in a specific way, on a specific lot, and that the lot was cleared in a specific fashion, and that the clearing is not incidental to the home's value. It is constitutive of it. The home is worth what it is worth partly because of the clearing. The school is what it is partly because of the clearing. The whole community's quality of life reflects, in part, the century of enforced whiteness that shaped its geography and its wealth and its social composition. The clearing happened once. The effects are ongoing. And here is what has not happened in most of the 10,000 towns and the 10,000 counties and the 50 million Americans who grew up in the communities that Warren Osgood's paperwork helped build. The reckoning. Not the dramatic public reckoning, the apology, the monument, the curriculum revision, the town meeting where everyone confronts the history and comes out the other side different. I mean the basic, private, individual reckoning that would happen if every American who grew up in a community that was white by design sat with that knowledge for long enough to understand its implications. The reckoning would not be guilt exactly. Guilt requires personal agency, and most people had none in the construction of these towns. The reckoning would be something more useful than guilt, understanding. Understanding the origin of the thing you have. Understanding that the equity in the house was not just the product of your parents' hard work, but of a geographic and financial system that was available to your parents, and not to someone else's parents. Understanding that the school you went to was as good as it was, not just because the community valued education, but because the community had been arranged, by law, and by pressure, and by the concrete base of a signpost, in a way that concentrated resources on one side of a line. Understanding does not return anything. It does not rebuild what was taken. But it changes the story. It changes the story from a natural history. This is how things are. To a political history. This is how things were made by specific people, for specific reasons, with specific results. And a political history can be changed. A political history has agents and decisions and alternatives. A natural history just is. A political history is something you can be inside of and examine and possibly choose to continue or to try to change. The sign is gone from the post. The concrete base is under the grass or the asphalt. The post stood there for 40 years, and the sign was on it for 40 years, and then it came down. The coming down of the sign was real. It was progress. I am not being cynical about the progress. I am saying that the sign was never the whole system. The sign was the announcement of the system. It was the label on the building. When you take down the label, the building is still there. Mavis Holly stands at her kitchen window and watches her granddaughter drive away. The car turns north at the end of the block, toward the highway, toward the university, through Whitfield County, and beyond it. Diane drives through the flat Illinois morning with her coffee in the cup holder and her GPS navigating and her whole life ahead of her. And she does not carry the map. And this is right. And Mavis is glad for it, and glad for everything that had to happen for the map to no longer be necessary, for the generations of work and sacrifice and legal struggle, and the ordinary courage of women and men who simply insisted on being treated as what they were. And Mavis also, at the same moment, in the same kitchen, holds the other knowledge. The knowledge that the county is 97% white. The knowledge of why. The knowledge that why is not ancient history, but recent arithmetic. The compound interest of exclusion still paying out in school funding and property values and the unearned head start that some children receive, and others do not. She holds both things. This is what it costs to know the history. You have to hold both things. You have to be glad and be accounting at the same time. The sign came down. But a sign is just wood and paint. What a sign announces, the policy, the practice, the enforced geography, the century of accumulated effect, that is made of harder stuff. It is made of deeds and ordinances and property values and school districts, and the particular whiteness of a county that has been white for so long that nobody alive remembers when it wasn't. It is made of the tools left in the shed, the wages never fully paid, the house never purchased, the equity never accumulated, the inheritance never given. It is made of the map that was carried, that had to be carried, for 30 years on a passenger seat. The signs came down. Some of it is still load-bearing. This is not the end of the story. The story does not have an ending, not a proper one, because the conditions that the story describes are still producing consequences, still shaping the geography, still determining which children go to which schools and which families build, which kinds of wealth in which kinds of places. The story is ongoing, embedded in the landscape, in the tax rolls, in the school performance data, in the racial composition of every community that was organized along the lines that Warren Osgood and William Levitt and the FHA's actuaries and the mob in Pierce City and the police officer who escorted Theo Banks to the county line, all, in their various ways, contributed to. The archive is open. The deeds are in the county records office. The green books are in libraries, if you want to see the shape of the gap. To understand, geographically, the difference between where black travelers could safely stop and where they could not. The census data tells you what happened to the counties and the suburbs and the school districts over a century. The math of the racial wealth gap tells you what a century of geographic exclusion compounded over generations. James Lowen's book was published in 2005. It is in some curricula and not in others. The choice of whether it is taught in any given school, in any given county, is itself a political decision made by people who have varying degrees of interest in students knowing this history and varying degrees of interest in protecting the story that the community tells about itself. The story a community tells about itself is not neutral. It shapes what children believe is normal, what they believe they deserve, what they believe others deserve. A community that tells its children that its whiteness is natural, that its wealth is earned, that its school's excellence is the product of its residents' values rather than the product of a century of exclusion. That community is educating its children in a fiction, a useful fiction for those who benefit from it. An unjust fiction for those who don't. The sign is down. The post hole is filled. The history is in the archive. What we do with it is up to us. Curtis Aiken walked away from the shed at 5:47 on a September evening in 1903. His tools left behind, his wages in his pocket, his wife waiting at the boarding house on Prentice Street. He walked down the gravel road toward the county highway, past the city limit sign with its white pine board and its black paint and its large, legible letters. He did not read the sign. He had read signs like it before. He walked south. The sun touched the tree line. Behind him, the shed stood solid in the amber light. Cedar planks fitted tight, square corners, a good roof that would hold against any winter. He had built it to last. It would last. The railroad company would use it for tools and supplies for 20 years, and the town would use the railroad for 50 years after that, and the railroad would shape the town's economy and the town's growth and the town's property values and the town's schools, and none of that would have anything to do with Curtis Aiken, whose name would not appear in any history of the town, whose tools would rust quietly in the shed he built, whose departure on that September evening would be noted by no record except the town's silence on the subject. He walked. The gravel crunched under his boots. Somewhere behind him, in the town that was now closing itself back up like a wound, a door shut. The sun went down. 10,000 times the sun went down, in 10,000 towns, and 10,000 families gathered what they could carry and walked toward the county line. The numbers are not metaphor. The architecture is not memory. The wealth that did not accumulate is not philosophical. The sign said what it said. The sign is gone. The country it described is not entirely gone. It is in the deed books and the property records and the tax rolls and the school district lines and the demographic charts of 10,000 American communities that are mostly still white, not by coincidence, but by design. A design that was executed a century ago with signs and mobs and legal pads and silence, and that has been maintained since then by the simple, durable, compound force of everything that was built on the cleared field. Look at the towns you drive through. Look at the census data. Ask who lived there before. Ask where they went. The answers are in the archive. They have been there all along, waiting for someone to ask.